Get ready for a journey back in time, one that is deeply questionable, mildly horrifying, and absolutely guaranteed to make you grateful for modern medicine. Tonight, you are about to experience the absolute nightmare that was medieval healthcare. And let me tell you, if you were alive back then, you'd have zero chance of survival. Splinter in your finger. Death. God, that won't go away. Definitely death. Slightly sad mood. For some reason, also death. Because in medieval times, people weren't just bad at curing diseases. They were actively making everything worse. So, get comfortable, turn the lights down, and let history ruin your sense of security. Drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from, and what time it is there, because I want to know exactly when and where medieval nonsense is invading your sleep. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come on, subscribe now, because trust me, you are going to need a lifetime of comfort history after hearing what these medieval doctors were up to. Now let's begin. You open your eyes in a cold, dimly lit room, and something is very wrong. Your head is pounding, your stomach is uneasy, and for some reason, your right leg feels like it doesn't belong to you anymore. You don't know what's happening. But one thing is certain, you are in medieval Europe, and that means you are about to have the worst medical experience of your life. It starts with the doctor, who is not actually called a doctor, because medicine is just a vague idea at this point in history. No. You're about to be treated by a barber surgeon, and yes, you heard that right. Your medical professional is also the guy who cuts hair. He will trim your beard, cut your hair, and if needed, saw your leg off, all in one appointment. Efficient. Yes, terrifying. Also, yes. The barber surgeon approaches, looks you over, and nods sagely, which does absolutely nothing to inspire confidence. He examines your pulse by holding your wrist like he's checking. If you're still alive, you barely are. Then asks you to stick out your tongue, because apparently that is how diagnoses are made here. He frowns. This is not good. Now, let's pause here for a moment. You might be wondering, what's wrong with me? Well, the short answer is nobody knows, because medieval doctors weren't actually diagnosing real diseases. Instead, they had something called the four humours, which was probably the worst medical theory in history. According to medieval medicine, your body was controlled by four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If one of these fluids became unbalanced, you would become sick, cursed, or possibly insane. Right now, your barber, surgeon has decided that your humours are deeply unbalanced, and there is only one solution. He needs to drain the bad fluid out of you. And do you know what that means? That's right. It's bloodletting time. This is where things go very badly. The barber, surgeon grabs a small, terrifying knife, muttering about your excess blood, like it's a rotten ingredient in a medieval soup recipe. You protest, obviously, because having blood is incredibly useful. But this is medieval medicine, and refusing treatment is not an option. Before you know it, the knife slices across your arm, and your blood pours into a shallow wooden bowl. The barber, surgeon nods approvingly, claiming that you will feel better once enough bad blood is removed. This is deeply concerning, because you were under the impression that all of your blood was important. But apparently, medieval medicine has zero interest in keeping you alive. You grow dizzy, your vision blurs, and then everything fades to black. You wake up cold, weak, and deeply regretting every choice that led to this moment. Your arm aches, your vision is unsteady, and your medieval barber, surgeon is nodding approvingly, claiming that your bloodletting was a great success. You do not feel successful. You feel like you are seconds away from never existing again. But apparently, medieval medicine has more treatments to offer, because your misery is not over yet. Now, you might be wondering, surely they had better ways to treat people? No, absolutely not. In fact, your next prescription is possibly the worst idea they have ever had. Your barber, surgeon, steps aside, calling forward a deeply suspicious-looking man holding a large jar filled with something that is absolutely moving. It is leeches. Thousands of them, and they are very excited to meet you. You attempt to protest, obviously, because adding more blood loss to your day is not on your schedule. But medieval medicine does not care about your feelings. Before you can react, the jar is opened, and a handful of squirming, slimy creatures are placed directly onto your skin. They immediately latch on, beginning their deeply unnecessary feast, sucking away whatever is left of your rapidly declining health. Your barber, surgeon, nods again. He is very proud of his work today. You, however, are absolutely going to pass out again. The worst part, if you survive this, you will still not be cured, because medieval medicine does not understand the concept of recovery. Oh no. They have one more treatment left, and trust me, it's only going to make things worse. At this point, you are barely hanging on. Your pulse is weak, your limbs feel like they belong to someone else, and your barber, surgeon, is still convinced he is doing an excellent job. He wipes his hands on his deeply unsanitary apron, steps back, and announces that your treatment is going well. This is deeply concerning, because you are absolutely on the verge of dying. And yet, he is not done, because medieval doctors never stopped experimenting, and you are about to experience one of the worst treatments yet. Now, in modern times, if someone has a raging fever, the obvious response is to help them cool down, let them rest, and keep them hydrated. Medieval doctors, however, had a very different approach. If you had a fever, they believed the only way to cure it was to boil the illness out of you. Yes, you heard that right. They were about to make you hotter. You are delirious, barely aware of what's happening, until suddenly, you feel warmth creeping over your skin. You turn your aching head, blinking through the haze of pain, and that's when you see it. The barber, surgeon, has prepared a steaming hot bath, filling a large wooden tub with scalding water. You attempt to protest, because at this point, everything they do only makes you feel worse. But medieval medicine does not listen to reason. Before you know it, you are being placed into the water, and immediately, your skin feels like it is seconds away from peeling off. You thrash weakly, trying to escape, but you have no strength left. The barber, surgeon, soothes you, promising that the heat will cure you, that the illness will leave your body, that everything will be fine. It is absolutely not fine. You are boiling alive, and every cell in your body is screaming at you to get out. And yet, medieval doctors have zero concerns about your suffering. You are left to stew in your own misery, the heat creeping into your bones, your fever raging harder than ever, your mind swirling into something dangerously close to unconsciousness. Now, let's pause here. Because even though this treatment is an absolute disaster, medieval medicine was about to get even worse. You might think this bath is the final, terrible end to your suffering, but you would be wrong, because they are already preparing the next treatment, and trust me, it will absolutely ruin your night. We will continue, because, unfortunately, you are definitely going to die. You thought the bloodletting was bad. You thought the leeches were horrifying. You thought boiling alive in a wooden tub was the worst thing that could possibly happen to you. But no, your barber, surgeon has one more treatment in mind, and trust me, it is absolutely the worst one yet. Because if there is one thing medieval doctors loved more than making people suffer, it was accidentally making everything worse with terrible, deeply questionable logic. You are barely holding on, your body heavy with exhaustion, your pulse weaker than ever, and yet, your barber, surgeon is not concerned at all. In fact, he looks pleased, because you have survived every treatment so far, and that means you are a strong patient. He pats your shoulder, murmuring something about your excellent constitution, and then proceeds to ruin your life even more. You watch in horror as he steps toward a large wooden table, sorting through his collection of deeply suspicious medieval medical tools. And that's when you see it. The jar. It is filled with powder, a mixture so fine it looks like dust, and you immediately know this is not going to end well. Now, in modern times, if someone is recovering from an illness, the obvious response is to let them rest, monitor their symptoms, and ensure they receive proper care. Medieval doctors, however, had a very different approach. If you were sick, they believed the best way to cure you was to force your body to purge every last bit of disease, violently, and with absolutely no warning. Yes, you heard that right. They were about to make you vomit uncontrollably, and they were going to do it using poison. You try to protest, obviously, because at this point, you are barely surviving as it is. But medieval doctors do not care about your comfort. Before you can react, the barber, surgeon scoops up a handful of the powder, steps forward, and, with absolutely no hesitation, forces it into your mouth. The taste is immediately unbearable, like rotting metal, bitter herbs, and something that absolutely does not belong in a human body. And within seconds, the nausea hits you like a medieval battering ram straight to the stomach. You double over, gasping, trying to fight against the sickness. But there is no stopping this treatment now. Your body rejects everything inside of it, your stomach contracting violently, and suddenly, you are vomiting with a force that is genuinely impressive and deeply horrifying. Let's pause for a moment. You might be wondering, what exactly did they just poison me with? Well, medieval doctors had many questionable substances, but one of the worst was antimony powder, a toxic mineral that they believed could cleanse the body of disease. It did not. It only made patients violently ill, causing uncontrollable vomiting, dizziness, weakness, and sometimes death. And yet, they kept using it, because medieval medicine was not based on results. It was based on pure, unfiltered nonsense. At this point, you are practically collapsing, barely aware of what's happening anymore. Your barber, surgeon, however, is very satisfied with the outcome. He nods approvingly, watches as you continue suffering, and then steps back, murmuring something about the treatment working exactly as expected. You do not feel successful. You feel like you are seconds away from becoming a medieval ghost. And honestly, you probably are. Now, most people would stop here. Surely, after all of this, medieval medicine must finally be done with you. Right? Wrong. Because there is one more treatment left, and trust me, it is going to ruin your entire night. At this point, your body is barely functioning. Your limbs feel like sacks of wet flour, and your barber, surgeon, is still shockingly confident that all of this is somehow good for you. You have survived the bloodletting, endured the leeches, boiled alive in a deeply questionable medieval spa, and vomited until reality no longer feels real. Surely, this must be the end of your suffering. Surely, they have run out of terrible ideas. Surely, you will finally be allowed to rest. Absolutely not. Because there is one last treatment left, and trust me, you are absolutely not going to enjoy it. Now, you might be wondering, What could possibly be worse than everything I've already endured? Well, my friend, the answer is medieval surgery. And let me tell you, you are not ready for what's about to happen. Your surgeon steps away from the table, muttering thoughtfully, as if he is deciding what parts of you still need to be fixed. This is deeply concerning, because you already feel like every organ in your body is on strike. And then, he turns back to you, holding a very large and very sharp knife, and for some reason, he looks very excited about what's coming next. This is not good. This is very, very bad. You try to sit up, try to protest, but you have no strength left. Your limbs are refusing to obey, your vision is blurring, and your surgeon is already examining your body, deciding where to cut. Because medieval surgery was not careful, precise, or remotely scientific. No. It was aggressive, reckless, and often entirely unnecessary. And you, my unfortunate medieval patient, are about to experience all of it. At this point, your body is barely functional. Your surgeon is shockingly confident in his ability to cure you, and your odds of survival are decreasing every second. Your pulse is weak, your limbs feel like they belong to someone else, and yet, your medieval doctor is still preparing one last deeply unnecessary and wildly painful treatment, because medieval medicine does not know when to stop. And now, you are about to experience the absolute worst part of all, medieval surgery. The surgeon examines your body, frowning thoughtfully, like a man deciding which unfortunate medieval haircut to give you. Only this time, he is not cutting hair. No. He is cutting something much worse, and he looks far too excited about it. You attempt to protest, obviously, because you are barely surviving as it is, and having a man who doubles as a barber carve into your body with a knife is absolutely the worst idea imaginable. But medieval medicine does not care about your feelings. Before you can react, the surgeon firmly grips your arm and without warning begins cutting. There is no anesthesia, no pain relief, no concern for your suffering. There is only raw, unfiltered medieval horror. You scream, but nobody cares. Because in medieval times, screaming during surgery was just part of the process. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly is he cutting into? The answer is whatever he decides. Because medieval surgery was not precise. It was not scientific. It was pure guesswork, reckless confidence, and deeply questionable blade techniques. Some procedures were supposedly meant to remove infected tissue, while others were based entirely on medieval superstition, which is a terrible foundation for surgery. In your case, your surgeon has decided you have a build-up of bad humors, and the only way to fix this problem is to remove something, anything, inside you. You thrash weakly, trying to escape, but you have no strength left. The pain is unbearable, tearing through your body like medieval dentistry gone horribly wrong. The surgeon pauses occasionally, nodding to himself like a man who believes he is doing excellent work, before slicing into another section of your rapidly failing body. And then, it gets worse. Because medieval doctors did not understand infection, which means they did not sanitize their tools properly. The knife has already been used on other unfortunate patients, and now it is absolutely spreading disease directly into your open wound. You have never been closer to death than you are right now. Finally, the surgeon steps back, wiping his blood-covered hands on a rag that is definitely not clean. He nods approvingly, claiming that your surgery was a success. You do not feel successful. You feel like you are seconds away from becoming a medieval ghost. And honestly, you probably are. And so, your medieval nightmare ends, but not because you have been cured. No. No, it ends because your body has officially given up. Because medieval healthcare was not designed to heal you. It was designed to make sure you suffered as much as possible before dying in spectacular fashion. The Black Death was not just a disease. It was a force of absolute destruction, wiping out entire villages, devastating cities, and leaving behind nothing but fear, decay, and desperation. And the worst part, medieval medicine had absolutely no idea how to handle it. Physicians, priests, and self-proclaimed healers scrambled to find cures, clinging to ancient theories and deeply flawed medical practices that did nothing but worsen the suffering of those infected. The moment plague symptoms appeared, fever, chills, swollen buboes filled with pus, panic set in immediately. People knew that once the sickness took hold, survival was nearly impossible. And yet medieval doctors insisted that they could still save their patients. Their methods, however, were nothing short of horrifying. The first step, as always, was bloodletting. It was the go-to solution for nearly everything, no matter how deadly the disease actually was. Physicians believed the plague was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids, and the best way to fix that was to drain large amounts of blood directly from the patient. Sharp knives, heated metal instruments, or even leeches were used to open veins and remove what was thought to be corrupted blood. Did this help? No, it absolutely did not. In fact, it accelerated death. The infected were already weak, their bodies barely functioning under the weight of the disease, and removing blood only brought them closer to complete collapse. If bleeding didn't work, doctors moved on to purging, convinced that forcing the body to violently expel everything inside it would rid the patient of disease. They used harsh substances, dangerous herbs, toxic minerals, and highly questionable mixtures designed to cause uncontrollable vomiting or extreme diarrhea. If someone survived the purge, it was not because it helped, but because their body somehow managed to withstand an even greater attack than the plague itself. A particularly awful purging method involved antimony powder, a poisonous mineral that could trigger non-stop vomiting, dizziness, and weakness. A patient who was barely hanging on would be force-fed this toxin, their body shaking as sickness overwhelmed them, their energy drained entirely. And yet, the physicians would nod approvingly, insisting that this was progress. For those suffering from swollen buboes, large, painful lumps filled with plague, infected pus, medieval doctors had another deeply disturbing treatment ready. Poultices were applied directly to the skin, meant to draw out sickness and bring relief. But these poultices were not made from medicinal herbs or anything remotely useful. No, they were made from some of the worst substances imaginable. Crushed toads were smeared over open wounds, their bodies thought to absorb the disease and carry it away. Human excrement was applied directly to the skin, doctors believing that waste could somehow overpower the plague. And if that wasn't horrifying enough, patients were sometimes forced to bathe in urine, convinced that soaking in filth could cleanse them of sickness. In reality, these treatments only made things worse, introducing new infections, worsening symptoms, and ensuring death arrived even faster. Fear ruled the streets as people desperately sought protection. Some believed that bad air carried the plague, so they burned herbs, lit candles, and surrounded themselves with strong smells, convinced they could purify the air and drive away death. But the sickness spread regardless, unaffected by superstition. Others believed the plague was divine punishment, their sins catching up to them, and they turned to priests for salvation. Prayers were whispered, desperate pleas for mercy offered. But divine intervention never came. Cities became graveyards, homes emptied overnight, and the streets filled with the sounds of suffering. The only real method of survival was escape. Those who fled plague-ridden areas had the best chance of living. But not everyone had the resources to leave. Nobles abandoned cities, retreating to isolated estates, while the poor remained trapped in infected streets with no way out. Plague doctors roamed between the dying, their terrifying bird-like masks hiding their faces, filled with scented herbs meant to protect them from the disease. But even they could not avoid infection forever. And yet, despite everything, medieval doctors never truly learned from their failures. When the plague returned years later, their methods remained unchanged. Bloodletting, purging, and toad poultices were once again used, as if repeating the same mistakes could somehow bring a different result. The suffering continued, the deaths mounted, and history repeated itself with devastating certainty. But the Black Death was only one part of medieval medical disaster. There were countless other diseases, countless other treatments that ensured no one truly escaped suffering. And if you thought this was bad, just wait, because medieval medicine had many more ways to ruin lives. If there was one thing medieval doctors absolutely refused to do, it was admit they had no idea what they were doing. So when syphilis began sweeping through Europe, causing deeply unpleasant symptoms, their solution was not to study the disease, investigate how it spread, or develop treatments that actually made sense. No. Their immediate response was, what if we just cover the patient in mercury and hope for the best? And that is exactly what they did. Now, in modern times, we understand that mercury is incredibly toxic and should absolutely not be used as medicine under any circumstances. But medieval doctors did not care about toxicity. They cared about finding dramatic cures. And mercury just looked like the kind of substance that might do something. So they decided it was perfect, and before anyone could protest, mercury became the #1 treatment for syphilis. The treatments were deeply questionable, varying from ointment rubs to full-body mercury baths. Doctors believed that the mercury would purge the disease from the body, either through absorption into the skin or forced sweating. This led to some truly horrifying results, because patients were exposed to dangerous amounts of mercury, leading to severe poisoning. Within days, they began experiencing neurological symptoms, tremors so violent they could barely hold objects, memory loss that made them forget entire conversations, insanity that convinced them medieval ghosts were whispering in their ears. And just when they thought things couldn't get worse, their kidneys started failing, ensuring their health declined rapidly. But medieval doctors did not learn from this. Instead, they took one look at their patient, who was now violently shaking, hearing voices, and completely unable to function, and said, "Ah, yes, the treatment is working. Absolutely unbelievable." Now, you might be wondering, did anyone try to stop this nonsense? Absolutely not, because medieval medicine was committed to its worst ideas, and mercury remained the primary treatment for syphilis for centuries. Even as patients collapsed, even as their bodies decayed faster than the disease itself, medieval doctors kept prescribing more mercury. At one point, physicians even developed a delightful new method of exposure: mercury inhalation therapy, where patients were forced to breathe in toxic fumes for hours. Did this cure syphilis? Absolutely not. Did it guarantee immediate poisoning and a deeply unpleasant death? Yes, it did. Eventually, as people continued dropping like flies, some doctors began asking questions. Wait, is mercury actually killing people? The answer was obviously yes, but unfortunately, It would take hundreds of years before medicine finally abandoned mercury treatments entirely. And by then, thousands of patients had been poisoned, driven insane, and absolutely ruined by the worst medical logic ever recorded. Because, as history has proven time and time again, medieval medicine was not designed to save anyone. It was designed to make sure you suffered as much as possible before dying in spectacular fashion. If medieval medicine had one defining trait, it was its commitment to making every illness infinitely worse before pretending it had solved the problem. And few treatments captured this truly spectacular level of nonsense better than trepanation. The deeply terrifying process of drilling holes in the skull to cure absolutely everything. Because, apparently, medieval doctors believed that if your head hurt, your thoughts were strange, or your body was suffering from uncontrollable seizures, the best possible solution was just to break your skull open and let the problem escape. Absolutely unbelievable. The treatment varied in levels of horror, depending on the physician and their personal preference for ruining someone's life. Some doctors opted for drilling, using rudimentary tools to carve small, circular openings into the skull. Others preferred scraping, slowly dragging sharp instruments across bone, wearing it down until a hole formed. And in more extreme cases, surgeons went straight for cutting, slicing through flesh and bone, with terrifying precision. Did anyone pause to consider the consequences of removing pieces of a person's skull? Absolutely not. Because medieval doctors firmly believed that the only way to cure illness was to make it significantly worse first. The reasoning behind trepanation was as ridiculous as expected. If someone suffered from migraines, medieval doctors assumed that bad humors had become trapped inside the head, and the only way to fix it was to give them an exit route, straight through the skull. If a patient experienced seizures, the diagnosis was often demonic possession, and rather than investigating neurological disorders, physicians decided that ghosts probably needed a door to leave through. And if someone had mental illness, doctors believed that the brain itself was misbehaving, and obviously the best way to discipline it was to literally cut pieces of it out. The confidence was unbelievable. The logic was non-existent. And yet, this continued for centuries. Now, you might be wondering, surely trepanation had a shockingly high mortality rate? Absolutely. Because nothing says immediate death like open wounds, exposed brain tissue, and absolutely zero knowledge of germs or sterilization. Many patients died immediately, either from blood loss, extreme shock, or their body outright rejecting the absolute nonsense happening to it. Others survived the initial procedure, only to develop infections so catastrophic they barely lasted another week. And in rare cases, people lived through trepanation, only to spend the rest of their lives suffering from chronic migraines, memory loss, or deeply questionable cognitive function. And medieval doctors, they never accepted the blame. Instead, they claimed that if someone died after the procedure, it was because the patient's humors were already too corrupted to be saved. Unbelievable. Eventually, as medicine advanced, trepanation was slowly abandoned. Not because doctors realized it was a horrible idea, but because newer, equally terrible treatments replaced it. Medieval people were deeply committed to misunderstanding disease, and few theories captured their spectacular level of scientific confusion better than miasma theory, the belief that sickness was spread through bad air. Yes, that's right. Rather than recognizing that bacteria, viruses, or direct contact with infected individuals could cause disease, medieval physicians firmly believed that illness drifted through the air like an invisible, cursed fog. infecting anyone who inhaled it. And their solution: burning absolutely everything they could get their hands on. Because, clearly, if the air was bad, the logical response was to set things on fire until the smell changed. The obsession with fumigation became wildly excessive. Because once medieval people convinced themselves that disease was floating in the atmosphere, they couldn't resist trying to purge the air with increasingly horrible fumes. Cities and homes were filled with smoke as people burned herbs, spices, and flowers, desperately attempting to drive sickness away. Did this work? Absolutely not. Because while some pleasant smelling herbs might have provided mild respiratory relief, they had zero effect on actual disease transmission. But medieval people were not satisfied with failure. So instead of reconsidering their logic, they decided that they simply hadn't burned strong enough substances yet. So they escalated. And this is where things became truly horrifying. You see, medieval fumigation did not stop at harmless herbs. People started burning anything they could find, convinced that if the stench was strong enough, it would overpower whatever evil force was poisoning the air, which led to some deeply questionable choices, including sulfur, because apparently choking on toxic fumes was an acceptable cure for disease. Tar, because why not fill the streets with suffocating smoke? Animal dung, because obviously burning waste was going to make the air cleaner. Spoiler, it did not. Human hair and bones, because some desperate individuals decided that fire-based rituals might make their situation slightly less disastrous. The result? People actively poisoning themselves with smoke inhalation, carbon monoxide exposure, and deeply unsettling respiratory damage, all while achieving absolutely nothing in terms of stopping actual disease. And the worst part, they did not learn from this failure. Instead, they kept doing it every time a new sickness appeared, convinced that next time it would definitely work. Now, you might be wondering, surely some physicians recognized that fumigation was making things worse? Absolutely not. Because medieval doctors were fully committed to their nonsense, refusing to abandon their theories even as their patients collapsed from lung damage. Some doubled down, insisting that the sickness was merely resisting the purification process, and the only way to truly remove it was to burn even more materials. Others claimed that the failure of fumigation meant that an even greater supernatural force was at work, leading people to combine smoke rituals with prayers, blessings, and deeply unnecessary exorcisms. And in some cases, entire city streets were set ablaze, because if small fires didn't work, surely larger fires would. Absolutely unbelievable. Eventually, as medicine advanced, the miasma theory was slowly abandoned, but not because doctors realized it was a terrible idea. No. It was only replaced when germ theory finally emerged, proving that disease was caused by microorganisms rather than cursed air. But by then, medieval cities had already spent centuries ruining their lungs, poisoning themselves, and setting absolutely everything on fire in an attempt to purify the atmosphere. Because medieval medicine was never designed to make sense. It was designed to ensure the maximum amount of suffering before death. Medieval people had a truly spectacular ability to make bad decisions, and few choices captured their commitment to absolute disaster better than the restrictions placed on physicians after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Because when faced with the question, should qualified people be the ones performing surgeries, the Church immediately decided, no, absolutely not. Instead of allowing skilled clergy to continue their medical practice, they banned them from performing surgery altogether, leading to a truly horrifying era where barbers were suddenly in charge of cutting people open. Absolutely unbelievable. Now, in modern times, surgeons are required to undergo extensive training, master complex procedures, and develop a deep understanding of anatomy before ever picking up a scalpel. But in medieval Europe, surgical qualifications amounted to owning sharp knives, not passing out at the sight of blood, having enough confidence to cut into someone without worrying about the consequences. And that is how barber surgeons were born. Because when real doctors were forbidden from performing surgeries, barbers, the guys who trimmed beards and cut hair, were suddenly responsible for amputations, wound care, and deeply horrifying medical procedures, which obviously resulted in catastrophic mortality rates. Because, as expected, getting a haircut and getting your leg removed should not be services provided by the same person. The results were as terrible as you'd expect. Barber surgeons approached surgery with the same enthusiasm they had for haircuts, treating life-threatening procedures like routine maintenance. Patients were strapped down, held in place by assistants who had absolutely no medical training. Anesthesia? Absolutely not. Pain relief? Zero chance. Instead, barber surgeons just started cutting, ignoring screams, protests, and any reasonable expectations for safety. Some amputated limbs in a matter of seconds, believing that speed was more important than accuracy, which resulted in a lot of wildly uneven, deeply questionable surgical outcomes. Others carved into infected wounds with instruments that had never been cleaned, spreading disease faster than the original injury had caused. And when patients died in horrifying agony, barber surgeons simply shrugged and moved on to their next customer, whether for surgery or a fresh shave. Absolutely horrific. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone try to stop this nonsense? Absolutely not. Because medieval authorities were deeply committed to making healthcare worse, refusing to reconsider their ban on clergy performing surgery. Even as barber surgeons butchered their way through medieval hospitals. Instead of realizing their mistake, they doubled down, insisting that barbers could improve their techniques over time, completely ignoring the fact that thousands of patients had already died unnecessarily. And despite clear evidence that barber surgeons were absolutely not qualified, they continued performing surgeries for centuries, leaving behind a deeply unfortunate legacy of medieval medical failures. Eventually, as medicine advanced, real surgeons began reclaiming their field, pushing barber surgeons back toward haircuts and away from medical disasters. But by then, countless medieval patients had already suffered, died, or lost limbs unnecessarily, all because the church decided that trained physicians should not perform surgery. There are many more disasters left to uncover, many more horrific treatments waiting to ruin your night. Barber surgeons, 13th, 16th centuries, often untrained barbers doubled as surgeons and performed amputations and bloodletting with dirty instruments, spreading infection and causing death. Medieval medicine had one absolutely unshakable belief. If something was wrong with your body, it was probably because you had too much blood, and the only solution was removing as much of it as possible. And if physicians didn't feel like using knives, well, there was another deeply unpleasant option waiting for you: leeches. Because for centuries, doctors insisted that bloodletting with knives was effective, but bloodletting with leeches was somehow even better. And this is exactly how thousands of patients ended up covered in wriggling, slimy parasites, all because medieval doctors refused to reconsider their nonsense. Leeches became wildly popular, used in every medical treatment imaginable, because physicians believed they were the ultimate cure for unbalanced humors, Feeling weak and dizzy, leeches. Experiencing migraines, leeches. Recovering from childbirth, leeches. Just having a bad day, leeches. Because medieval doctors had zero impulse control when it came to bloodletting. And leeches were just another excuse to drain every last drop from a suffering patient. The treatment itself was horrific. A physician would select a handful of leeches, place them directly on your skin, and watch in satisfaction as they latched on. Within seconds, they would begin feeding, sucking, until their bloated little bodies were full of your blood. While the physician nodded approvingly, convinced that this was somehow beneficial. The worst part. There were never limits on how many leeches could be used. Some physicians covered their patients in dozens, convinced that the more blood they removed, the healthier the person would become. They were wrong, because excessive blood loss led to crippling anemia, making patients even weaker, even sicker, and significantly closer to death than before the leeches were involved. And if anemia wasn't bad enough, the leeches themselves could absolutely cause infections, because medieval physicians never bothered checking if the creatures were carrying diseases before sticking them onto open wounds. Which meant that after already losing dangerous amounts of blood, patients would then develop secondary infections, leading to horrific fevers, deep tissue decay, and wildly painful deaths. And when someone collapsed from the treatment, medieval doctors would genuinely believe that their humours must have been too corrupted to save, rather than acknowledging that leeches had absolutely ruined them. Unbelievable. Despite the clear and undeniable failures of leech therapy, physicians never stopped using them, continuing the practice for centuries, convinced that eventually it would prove effective. Even as patients dropped dead, even as infections spread, even as bloodletting itself was slowly abandoned, leeches remained part of medical treatments because medieval doctors refused to admit they were wrong. It was only much later, when actual medical research finally caught up with reality, that leech therapy was abandoned almost entirely. But by then, countless patients had already suffered, weakened, or died unnecessarily. Medieval people had an astonishing ability to misunderstand absolutely everything, and few diseases suffered from this confusion more than egotism, otherwise known as St. Anthony's fire. Because when people started hallucinating, suffering intense convulsions, and feeling as if their limbs were burning from the inside, medieval doctors did not ask, could this be caused by contaminated food? No. Instead, they immediately decided that this was either divine punishment or demonic possession, and proceeded to make everything significantly worse with horrific treatments. The root cause of ergotism was a toxic fungus that grew on rye, infecting grain supplies and causing extreme neurological and vascular symptoms when consumed. But since nobody understood food contamination, yet physicians assumed that anyone experiencing ergot poisoning was either cursed, sinful, or actively under attack by supernatural forces, which meant the treatments were not based on medicine. They were based on spiritual purification and violent physical suffering. And this is how thousands of unfortunate people ended up being burned, poisoned, and butchered, all because their bread had been slightly moldy. Absolutely unbelievable. The treatment methods were as horrific as expected. First, physicians prescribed aggressive purging, believing that if they could force the body to violently expel everything inside it, the sickness would leave. Patients were given toxins, harsh herbs, and deeply unpleasant mixtures that caused uncontrollable vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration, leaving them significantly closer to death than before. And when this did not work, Medieval doctors escalated things with heat exposure, convinced that if the sickness felt like burning flesh, the logical response was to literally set patients on fire, which led to some truly questionable treatments, including holding afflicted limbs over open flames, because apparently burning skin was supposed to neutralize internal suffering, wrapping patients in steaming hot blankets, ensuring they became completely overwhelmed by suffocating heat, forcing people into enclosed rooms filled with smoke, believing that inhaling thick fumes would drive out the disease. The result? People not only suffered from ergot poisoning, but also endured burns, dehydration, and absolute respiratory collapse, all because medieval doctors refused to investigate the actual cause of their suffering. And if heat exposure wasn't bad enough, cauterization was the final, horrific solution. Doctors believed that if a patient's limbs were turning black and decaying, they needed to burn the infected areas immediately, leading to medieval patients being subjected to searing hot irons, direct flame application, and excruciating cauterization procedures. Did this cure them? Absolutely not. Did it ensure maximum agony before death? Yes it did. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone ever figure out that ergotism was caused by contaminated rye? Yes, but not until centuries later. Because for hundreds of years, physicians, priests, and desperate villagers continued believing that ergot poisoning was either divine punishment or a supernatural affliction. And every time a new outbreak occurred, they responded with the same horrific purges, burns, and bloodletting techniques, refusing to consider that maybe the problem was in the grain itself. It was only much later, when actual research finally caught up with reality, that people recognized ergot poisoning for what it was: a toxic reaction to fungal contamination. There are many more disasters left to uncover, many more horrific treatments waiting to ruin your night. If medieval medicine had a motto, it would be something like, if it's already bad, make it worse. And few treatments embodied this philosophy better than boiling oil for wound care. Because when medieval doctors saw an open injury, their immediate response was, what if we pour scalding liquid into it and hope for the best? Absolutely unbelievable. The idea behind the treatment was technically based on logic, but absolutely the wrong kind of logic. Physicians believed that wounds became infected because bad substances lingered inside them. And if they could burn those impurities away, patients would heal faster and avoid deadly complications. Unfortunately, instead of realizing that heat alone does not magically erase infection, medieval doctors decided that the best course of action was boiling oil, poured directly into the open wound, with zero pain relief and zero concern for human suffering. The treatment itself was a disaster from the moment it began. Patients, already injured from battle, accidents, or deeply questionable medieval decisions, were forced to lie still as physicians heated massive pots of oil over open flames, waiting until it reached a bubbling, dangerously scalding temperature. Then, without hesitation, the boiling liquid was poured directly onto the wounded flesh, instantly causing blistering, nerve destruction, and absolutely unbearable agony. People screamed, thrashed, collapsed, and sometimes died immediately from shock, but medieval doctors did not stop. Because to them, the pain meant the treatment was working. Meanwhile, the burned tissue became even more vulnerable to infection, meaning that instead of preventing complications, this method actually created more problems. And if a patient somehow survived the initial treatment, they were often left with deep, agonizing scars, their skin tightened, ruined, and permanently damaged, all because someone thought boiling oil was a substitute for real medical care. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone ever realize this was an absolutely horrific idea? Yes, but much later than you'd expect. Because despite the obvious suffering, this method remained in use for centuries, with physicians insisting that boiling oil was the only way to guarantee a wound would not rot. It wasn't until Ambroise Paré, a 16th century French surgeon, accidentally ran out of oil while treating wounded soldiers that a better method was discovered. Desperate for an alternative, he used a gentler balm of egg yolks, oil of roses, and turpentine, and to his surprise, those treated with the balm healed faster and suffered less pain than those who had been burned with oil. And just like that, medicine finally caught up with reality. Boiling oil was abandoned, replaced with more effective wound treatments, and medieval doctors were forced to admit that their obsession with pouring scalding liquid into injuries had been, as expected, an absolutely terrible idea. But medieval medicine never stopped being a disaster. Medieval doctors were terrible at understanding infections, but that never stopped them from confidently making the worst possible treatment decisions. And when it came to wound care, they had one guiding principle: if the injury looks bad, let's rub something even worse on it. Which is how they ended up smearing bile and dung directly onto open wounds, convinced that doing so would somehow draw the infection out and magically promote healing. Absolutely unbelievable. The logic behind this disaster was based on wildly incorrect assumptions. Physicians believed that disease was caused by corrupted bodily fluids, meaning that the only way to cure an infected wound was to pull those bad fluids out using external substances. And, obviously, if you wanted something to draw out infection, you needed something strong, potent, and deeply disgusting. So they turned to boar's bile, fluid extracted from pig intestines, and animal dung, because apparently, medieval doctors had zero impulse control when it came to rubbing filth into wounds. The treatment process was exactly as horrifying as it sounds. A physician would take a handful of fresh dung, or a cloth soaked in bile, press it firmly against the wounded area, and instruct the patient to leave it there for hours or even days. If the wound smelled worse over time, that was considered a good thing, because medieval doctors believed that the stronger the stench, the more poison was being pulled from the body, which, obviously, was completely incorrect. Instead of curing infection, these poultices introduced even more bacteria, leading to horrific tissue decay, fevers, and deeply unpleasant deaths. And if a patient collapsed from infection, medieval physicians did not blame their terrible treatment choices. They simply assumed the sickness had been too strong to overcome. Unbelievable. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone ever stop using bile and dung poultices? Yes. Eventually, when medicine finally caught up with reality and doctors started realizing that rubbing filth into wounds was a guaranteed way to make things worse. But by then, countless medieval patients had already suffered, lost limbs, or died unnecessarily, all because their physicians thought farm waste was a suitable treatment option. Medieval medicine had zero interest in treating leprosy with compassion. And if there was one thing doctors loved more than making diseases worse, it was actively humiliating the people suffering from them. Because instead of offering real medical care, they decided that lepers were dangerous, cursed, and needed to be publicly marked as untouchable, which led to some of the worst social and medical mismanagement imaginable. The first mistake was forcing lepers into isolation, sending them to live outside of cities, away from society, because people believed the disease was highly contagious. Now, leprosy does spread, but it isn't nearly as infectious as medieval people believed. And yet anyone diagnosed with it. It was immediately banished from their homes, abandoned by their families, and stripped of their rights as citizens. And the worst part, lepers were forced to wear bells around their necks, ring them whenever they walked through public spaces, and loudly announce their presence so that everyone could avoid them. Because medieval society believed that being near a leper was enough to bring divine punishment upon you. Absolutely unbelievable. Meanwhile, the actual medical treatments were just as horrifying. Since physicians didn't understand what caused leprosy, their solutions were based on pure nonsense. And this is how lepers ended up being covered in toxic ointments, burned with hot irons, and forced into painful rituals that only worsened their suffering. Some treatments included bathing in vinegar and urine, because medieval doctors believed soaking in filth could cleanse the disease. Applying harsh ointments made from lead and arsenic, which only poisoned patients instead of healing them. Burning away infected flesh using cauterization, ensuring wounds became even worse and significantly increasing the chances of death. And if a patient did not recover from this absolute nightmare, medieval physicians would simply shrug, declare that their humors were too corrupted, and banish them permanently. Because if medieval medicine didn't know how to fix something, it just decided the patient was doomed. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone ever treat leprosy correctly? Yes, eventually, much later, when doctors finally started studying the disease properly and developing real medical approaches. Alright, brace yourself, because medieval medicine is about to fully commit to absolute nonsense. We've already seen leeches, bloodletting, boiling oil, and deeply unfortunate bodily waste treatments. But now, we're diving into snake oil, universal antidotes, and the wildly ridiculous belief that consuming crushed gems, venomous snake parts, and highly questionable mixtures could cure everything. The foundation of this disaster was the medieval obsession with panaceas, cures that supposedly worked for every single disease imaginable. Instead of treating illnesses individually, medieval physicians decided that there must be one single, magical remedy that could fix everything. And, naturally, they decided that if they just combined enough wildly dangerous ingredients, they would eventually discover it. So they began mixing absolutely anything they could think of, including snake flesh, because apparently consuming parts of vipers was supposed to make people immune to poison. Ground gems, because some physicians believed that if jewels were valuable, they must have healing properties. Theriac, a horrifyingly complex mixture that included opium, honey, viper flesh, and about 70 other ingredients with absolutely no logical connection to medicine. And this is how thousands of medieval patients ended up swallowing poisons, hallucinating wildly, and absolutely ruining their insides. All because their doctors refused to just focus on real treatment. The methods of preparation were as questionable as expected. Snake flesh was dried, crushed into powder, and mixed into tonics, ensuring that anyone drinking it experienced absolutely no benefit except a stomachache and deeply unpleasant regret. Ground gems were treated as elite medicine, reserved for the wealthy, with physicians claiming that sapphire could cure plague, emerald could cleanse the blood, and pearl could stop fevers. Except absolutely none of this was remotely true. And then there was theriac, an expensive, highly sought after panacea that was supposedly the greatest cure in history, but was actually just a wildly ineffective drug cocktail that made people deeply confused and occasionally unconscious. The worst part, people believed in theriac so strongly that it remained in use for centuries, despite the fact that its ingredients did absolutely nothing except make people feel mildly intoxicated. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone ever realize that these cures were completely useless? Absolutely not. Because medieval doctors were too committed to their nonsense to admit failure, meaning that even when patients continued dying despite consuming entire apothecaries of crushed jewels and snake powder, physicians simply assumed that the sickness was too strong, rather than considering that the cure was garbage. And this kept happening for centuries. Every time a new disease appeared, doctors sold even more snake oil, claiming that this time it would definitely work. Spoiler, it never did. It was only much later, when real medical research finally caught up with reality, that people slowly abandoned these medieval panaceas. Snake flesh was removed from medicine, ground gems became jewelry again, and theriac was finally exposed as pure nonsense. But by then, countless medieval patients had already suffered and died unnecessarily, all because their doctors refused to ask better questions. Because medieval medicine was never about saving lives. It was about ensuring maximum suffering before death. Medieval medicine was already a disaster, but in the 14th century, things somehow managed to get even worse. Because doctors decided that instead of relying on science, observation, or common sense, they would consult the stars instead. Yes, that's right. Medical treatments were no longer based on symptoms, disease progression, or actual patient needs. They were now determined by astrological charts, planetary alignments, and the deeply questionable belief that the movement of celestial bodies controlled human health. And this led to some truly catastrophic decisions, because medieval doctors were already bad at treating illnesses, and now they were making things even worse by bleeding, cutting, and poisoning people based on Jupiter's mood swings. Absolutely unbelievable. The concept was based on the belief that each zodiac sign governed a different part of the body, meaning that if someone was sick, their illness was caused by an imbalance in their planetary ruler. For example, medieval doctors believed that Aries controlled the head, so migraines were caused by poor Mars alignment. Leo ruled the heart, meaning that any chest pain meant the sun was displeased with you. Pisces governed the feet, so if someone had swollen ankles, they were obviously suffering from Neptune's bad attitude. This meant that all treatments, including bloodletting, surgery, and medication, were scheduled according to astrology rather than actual medical urgency, which, obviously, led to some of the worst healthcare decisions ever recorded. A patient could be actively dying, but if the stars were not aligned correctly, doctors would refuse to perform surgery, claiming that attempting a procedure during an unfavorable celestial moment would only make things worse. Meanwhile, bloodletting was scheduled according to planetary influence, meaning that doctors might drain a perfectly healthy patient simply because the moon suggested it was a good day for bleeding, and if someone actually needed urgent medical attention, they were sometimes forced to wait for the next favorable planetary shift, which meant many people died simply because their doctor decided Mercury wasn't cooperating that week. Unbelievable. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone ever realize astrology was a terrible medical system? Not for centuries. Astrological medicine remained widely accepted, with doctors consulting planetary charts before every major procedure, convinced that they could only heal patients if they had cosmic approval. It wasn't until real medical research finally caught up with reality that astrology was slowly abandoned, replaced by actual scientific methods. But by then, thousands of medieval patients had already suffered and died unnecessarily. All because their treatment depended on Saturn's mood swings. Medieval doctors had a truly spectacular ability to misunderstand human health, but few practices showcased the complete lack of medical accuracy better than urine diagnosis. Because when faced with the challenge of identifying diseases, they immediately decided, what if we just study pee? And that is exactly what they did. For centuries, physicians insisted that urine held the key to unlocking every illness imaginable, meaning that instead of carefully examining symptoms, researching causes, or developing structured medical tests, they simply looked at, smelled, and even tasted urine, and then confidently diagnosed whatever they thought was wrong. Absolutely unbelievable. The process itself was wildly questionable. Whenever a patient fell ill, doctors would demand a sample of their urine, carefully pouring it into a glass vial and holding it up to the light like it contained the secrets of the universe. They would then analyze it based on 3 deeply flawed criteria of color, which supposedly indicated the patient's overall health, smell, which they believed could reveal internal infections, taste, because, for some reason, medieval doctors believed licking pee was necessary for science. The worst part, they did this for every single disease, meaning that whether a patient had a broken bone, the plague, or a mysterious fever, their doctor would immediately grab the nearest vial and start sniffing urine instead of performing actual medical tests. Unacceptable. Misdiagnoses were absolutely rampant because physicians were not studying real symptoms. They were just making wild guesses based on pee color and personal interpretation. Some of the most absurd beliefs included dark urine meant the patient was suffering from internal decay. It was probably just dehydration. Sweet, smelling urine was a sign of approaching death. It was likely just diabetes. Cloudy urine indicated that a person's humors were corrupted. Absolutely meaningless nonsense. And since medieval doctors believed every single disease could be identified through urine, they often ignored obvious warning signs, leading to catastrophic misdiagnosis and completely inappropriate treatments. Which meant that if medieval urine tests suggested a disease was mild, but the patient was actually suffering from something fatal, physicians would prescribe weak remedies, delay urgent care, or simply declare the illness was harmless, only for the patient to collapse and die days later. Unbelievable. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone ever abandon this ridiculous method? Yes, eventually, when real medical science finally caught up with reality, doctors realized that urine was not a reliable way to diagnose diseases, and proper medical testing began replacing deeply flawed medieval pee analysis. But by then, countless medieval patients had already suffered and died unnecessarily. All because their doctors insisted that drinking urine was more effective than studying symptoms. Because medieval medicine was never about saving lives. Medieval and Renaissance medicine had zero impulse control when it came to questionable medical decisions. But few treatments embodied their absolute commitment to nonsense better than mumia. The practice of consuming ground up human remains as medicine. Yes, that's right. Physicians genuinely believed that powdered mummies were a universal cure, capable of healing anything from headaches to plague, leading to centuries of deeply horrifying consumption rituals. Which means that if you were sick in medieval Europe, your doctor would not give you an herbal remedy, a structured treatment, or even bloodletting. No. They would hand you a cup of crushed human bones and tell you to drink it immediately. Absolutely unbelievable. The foundation of this disaster came from a wildly incorrect belief that mummies contained powerful healing properties. because European physicians assumed that ancient Egyptian embalming techniques preserved spiritual energy inside the body. This led to a massive demand for ground-up human remains, meaning that traders, apothecaries, and desperate medical suppliers began harvesting, stealing, and crushing mummies from Egyptian tombs to sell them as medicine. Now, in modern times, we understand that eating preserved corpses has absolutely no health benefits. But medieval doctors refused to listen to reason, meaning that mumia remained widely accepted for centuries. And since real Egyptian mummies were expensive and difficult to obtain, people eventually started grinding up any old corpse they could find, leading to widespread contamination, horrific disease spread, and deeply disturbing medical products. Because when it came to medieval medicine, there were absolutely no limits on terrible ideas. The preparation process was just as horrifying as expected. Whenever a fresh supply of human remains arrived, apothecaries would carefully crush the bones into fine powder, scraping dried flesh and embalmed tissue into small flakes to be mixed with other questionable ingredients. Some mixtures were pure powdered mummy, while others were combined with wine honey or strong-smelling herbs, creating tonics, pills, or ointments that patients consumed or applied to their skin. And since physicians genuinely believed in mumia's healing power, they prescribed it for absolutely everything, including headaches. Because, obviously, crushing ancient skulls would fix modern pain. Internal bleeding, because drinking human powder was definitely the solution. Plague, because when faced with an unstoppable pandemic, medieval doctors immediately decided that the best cure was consuming fragments of long-dead strangers. The worst part, since mumia was so profitable, traders constantly sought new sources, which meant that even when real Egyptian mummies became harder to obtain, the practice did not stop. It simply shifted toward grinding up European corpses instead, which meant that thousands of patients were consuming ground-up, poorly preserved bodies, leading to horrific infections, bacterial contamination, and deeply unfortunate deaths, all because doctors refused to abandon their obsession with corpse-based medicine. Now you might be wondering, did anyone ever realize that eating crushed human remains was an absolutely horrific idea? Not for centuries. The practice remained widely accepted, spreading across Europe until the late Renaissance, when science finally began replacing medieval superstition. And when real medical research caught up with reality, mumia was slowly abandoned, replaced by actual medicine. But by then, countless medieval patients had already suffered and died unnecessarily, all because their doctors insisted that eating mummies was a legitimate cure. Medieval medicine had zero hesitation when it came to making diseases worse, and few treatments captured its absolute commitment to nonsense better than the practice of tying live animals to infected body parts as a cure for plague, leprosy, and various other illnesses. Because when faced with horrific swelling, pus-filled ulcers, and life-threatening infections, medieval doctors did not ask, could this be caused by bacteria, poor sanitation, or something scientifically explainable? No. Instead, they confidently decided, this must be bad energy trapped inside the body, and the only way to remove it is by attaching live chickens, pigeons, or random farm animals directly onto the patient. And this is exactly how thousands of medieval people ended up being strapped to live birds while actively dying from disease. All because their doctors refused to consider literally any alternative. Absolutely unbelievable. The practice stemmed from wildly incorrect beliefs about disease transmission and healing. Since medieval physicians did not understand germs, they assumed that illnesses were caused by invisible forces trapped inside the body, which meant that if you wanted to cure someone, you had to draw out the sickness using an external object. Now, most reasonable people might have tried herbal remedies, clean bandages, or literally anything remotely scientific, but medieval doctors had zero interest in logic, so instead, they decided that the most effective way to pull out sickness was to use live animals as magical disease vacuums. The treatment process was just as horrifying as expected. Whenever a patient was suffering from swollen buboes, rotting ulcers, or severe fever, their physician would grab the nearest chicken or pigeon, hold it against the infected area, and strap it tightly in place using cloth or rope. The belief was that the animal would absorb the disease, pulling it out of the human body and into its own, because, apparently, medieval doctors thought live birds worked like organic medieval sponges for sickness. The patient was then forced to sit in place, unmoving, while the terrified animal flapped, squawked, or writhed in confusion, completely unaware that it had been assigned to a highly questionable medical role. And if the animal struggled too much or died from the stress, physicians would simply remove it, grab another one, and repeat the process, convinced that eventually this ridiculous method would produce results. Unacceptable. The worst part? Not only did this treatment fail completely, it actively made the illness worse. Because instead of curing disease, strapping animals to infected wounds only introduced more bacteria, worsened fevers, and sometimes caused patients to die faster than they would have otherwise. Some common consequences included secondary infections caused by animal waste, dirt, or random feathers contaminating open wounds. Aggressive swelling because tying an anxious, struggling bird to a bubo or ulcer does absolutely nothing except increase irritation. Sepsis because instead of cleaning wounds properly, medieval doctors decided that random livestock should handle it instead. And when a patient collapsed from their worsening condition, physicians did not blame their ridiculous treatment method. They simply assumed the disease had been too strong to overcome and moved on to the next suffering medieval patient, preparing another unfortunate bird for duty. Absolutely unbelievable. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone ever realize that strapping chickens to sick people was a terrible idea? Not for centuries. The practice continued for far too long, with physicians insisting that animal absorption was a valid treatment. Even though 0 successful cases were ever recorded, it was only much later, when medicine finally caught up with reality, that doctors abandoned this nightmare, replacing it with actual science. But by then, countless medieval patients had already suffered and died unnecessarily, all because their doctors insisted that tying birds to people was a reasonable cure. At this point in history, medical professionals were not actually professionals. Surgical techniques were based on pure guesswork, and absolutely no one understood what infection was. Which meant that if you had an injured limb, your doctor would not attempt to heal it. No. They would take one look at you and immediately decide to cut it off, whether you needed an amputation or not. Because when in doubt, medieval surgeons always reached for the biggest, most terrifying saw imaginable. Now, in modern times, amputation is a last resort, performed with advanced precision, sterilization, and careful aftercare. But in medieval Europe, none of those things existed, meaning that every single amputation was basically a high-risk horror show. Surgeons believed that if a limb looked bad, cutting it off was the fastest way to solve the problem, ignoring the fact that most injuries could have healed on their own if treated properly. Which meant that if you walked into a medieval hospital with a deep cut on your leg. The doctor would say, "That'll have to come off." A broken arm. The doctor would shrug and say, "We should probably remove it." A mild sprain. The doctor would sigh and say, "Well, I guess we're cutting this off too." Because medieval surgeons did not believe in patience or healing. They believed in removing body parts aggressively and hoping for the best. The amputation process itself was an absolute nightmare. First, the patient was held down by assistants because anesthesia did not exist, meaning that every single amputation was performed while the person was fully awake and actively screaming. Then, the surgeon would grab the largest saw he could find, position it over the limb, and begin cutting as quickly as possible, because speed was considered more important than accuracy, which meant that most medieval amputations were performed in mere seconds, leaving behind uneven stumps, shredded muscle, and a truly terrifying amount of blood loss. And if the patient survived, they were then subjected to deeply questionable post-surgical care, including pouring boiling oil onto the wound, because apparently fire was the best way to prevent infection. Wrapping the stump in random cloth soaked in herbs, hoping that would somehow stop the bleeding. Saying a prayer and assuming divine intervention would handle the rest. And if the wound became infected, which happened constantly, well, that meant another amputation, because apparently, if removing a limb didn't work the first time, removing even more of you was obviously the solution. Absolutely unbelievable. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone ever realize medieval amputations were causing more harm than the actual injuries? Not for centuries. Surgeons continued cutting limbs off aggressively, believing that they were doing excellent work, even as mortality rates skyrocketed due to unchecked infections, blood loss, and deeply terrible aftercare. It wasn't until medicine finally caught up with reality that amputation techniques became more precise, controlled, and reserved for actual emergencies. But by then, countless medieval patients had already suffered and died unnecessarily, all because their doctors insisted that removing body parts was the fastest cure for everything. But now, we're diving into blistering therapy, an absolutely horrific treatment method where physicians used hot irons and corrosive chemicals to deliberately burn the skin, hoping that painful blisters would somehow pull disease out of the body. Yes, that's right. If you walked into a medieval hospital suffering from fever, infections, mysterious ailments, or literally any illness, your doctor would not prescribe rest, hydration, or actual medical care. No. They would grab the nearest burning, hot piece of metal and press it directly against your skin without hesitation. Absolutely unbelievable. The foundation of this disaster came from the wildly incorrect belief that disease could be drawn out of the body using external methods. Since medieval physicians did not understand germs, they assumed that sickness must exist in the blood, flesh, or humors, and the only way to remove it was to create artificial wounds and force the disease to exit through them. Which meant that when patients showed symptoms of plague, infections, or even mild fevers, doctors confidently decided, what if we just burn them until the sickness disappears? And this is how thousands of medieval people ended up covered in deliberately inflicted burns, while suffering from completely unrelated illnesses. All because their doctors refused to consider literally any alternative. The treatment process was as horrifying as expected. Whenever a patient complained of illness, their physician would select one of two deeply unfortunate options for blistering therapy: hot irons, heated over an open flame, then pressed directly onto the skin until blisters formed. Corrosive chemicals, made from acidic substances that melted layers of flesh until the burns were severe enough to satisfy the doctor. Both methods were guaranteed to cause unbearable pain, but medieval physicians believed that the more suffering a patient experienced, the more effective the treatment was. So instead of treating people gently, doctors would increase burn severity, making absolutely sure that patients developed large, infected blisters that could supposedly force sickness out of the body. Which meant that if you were unlucky enough to receive blistering therapy, you could expect to endure immediate, excruciating agony because medieval doctors had zero concept of pain management. Weeks of infected wounds, since burned flesh was left completely untreated, leading to horrific decay. Permanent scarring, because every single patient who survived was left with deep, visible marks from their unnecessary burns. And if the disease didn't disappear after the first session, physicians would repeat the entire process, increasing burn severity until the patient either recovered by sheer luck or died from overwhelming infection. Unacceptable. The worst part, not only did this treatment fail completely, but it actively made illnesses worse, because instead of curing disease, burning already sick patients only accelerated their suffering and introduced even more complications. Common consequences included secondary infections caused by exposed, untreated burn tissue, sepsis, because medieval doctors did absolutely nothing to prevent bacterial contamination, irreversible nerve damage, leaving surviving patients with chronic pain and deeply questionable medical trauma. And when a patient collapsed from this absolute disaster, physicians did not blame their treatment methods. They simply assumed the sickness had been too strong to overcome and moved on to their next suffering medieval patient. Absolutely unbelievable. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone ever realize that deliberately burning patients was a terrible idea? Not for centuries. Blistering therapy remained wildly popular, with doctors insisting that heat and chemical burns were essential to recovery, even though zero successful cases were ever recorded. And now we're diving into the royal touch, an absolutely absurd belief that kings possess divine healing powers capable of curing scrofula, also known as tuberculous lymphadenitis. Yes, that's right. Instead of turning to actual medical treatment, medieval people decided that all they needed to do was stand in front of the king, get touched by his very important hands, and wait for their disease to magically disappear. And this is how thousands of medieval people ended up actively spreading tuberculosis instead of curing it. All because their rulers confidently claimed that divine royal germs were somehow medicinal. Absolutely unbelievable. The foundation of this disaster came from the belief that monarchs were chosen by God, meaning that they supposedly possessed supernatural abilities, including the power to heal diseases with a simple touch. Now, in modern times, we understand that rubbing sweaty medieval hands on sick people has absolutely no medical benefit. But medieval doctors had zero understanding of germs, meaning that everyone fully committed to the idea that kings could eliminate disease simply by laying hands on afflicted subjects. Which meant that every time scrofula spread across Europe, thousands of infected people flocked to the palace, desperately waiting to be touched by their ruler in the hopes that this deeply questionable interaction would cure them. Spoiler: it absolutely did not. The treatment process was just as horrifying as expected. First, a massive crowd of sick, infected people would gather in front of the palace, forming a deeply concerning congregation of plague, fever, and uncontrollable coughing. Then, the king would step forward, wearing all his lavish royal attire, and proceed to touch as many diseased individuals as possible, murmuring holy blessings and wishing them well as tuberculosis spread aggressively through the crowd. Because instead of curing scrofula, the royal touch only ensured that even more people were exposed to deadly bacteria, accelerating disease transmission rather than stopping it. Which means that if you attended one of these deeply unfortunate royal healing sessions, you could expect to experience immediate disappointment, because the king's touch obviously did nothing. Extreme bacterial exposure, because standing in a large gathering of diseased people was the worst possible idea. A worsening infection, because tuberculosis was already aggressively spreading, and now you had royal germs added into the mix. And if someone died shortly after being blessed by the king, physicians did not blame the ridiculous treatment method. They simply assumed that the patient's sins were too strong to be purified and moved on to the next unfortunate medieval subject, who was about to get slapped by royalty. Unacceptable. The worst part. Not only did the royal touch fail completely, but it actively made tuberculosis worse, because instead of preventing disease, forcing kings to physically touch thousands of infected people only guaranteed that more individuals would get sick. Common consequences included rapid disease spread, because standing in huge crowds of sick people was just asking for disaster. A worsening public health crisis, because medieval rulers refused to reconsider their nonsense. Increasing mortality rates, because absolutely no one was receiving actual medical care. Just medieval pats on the head from kings, who really thought they were doing something. And when physicians saw patients collapsing after receiving the royal touch, they did not blame the absurdity of the situation. They simply claimed that the patient must have been too sinful to be saved, ignoring the fact that gathering thousands of people into plague-ridden crowds was obviously a terrible idea. Unbelievable. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone ever realize that touching diseased people was a terrible idea? Not for centuries. The practice remained wildly popular, with kings confidently performing public healing ceremonies, despite the fact that 0 successful cases were ever recorded, instead of seeking actual medical treatment. Medieval people confidently decided that the key to good health was marinating themselves in vats of warm, freshly collected blood, because apparently nothing says advanced medicine like sitting in a giant tub of liquefied farm animals. And this is how thousands of medieval people ended up covered in rapidly decaying organic fluid instead of receiving real treatment. Absolutely unbelievable. The foundation of this disaster came from the belief that blood contained vital life force energy, meaning that if a person was sick, weak, or suffering from blood disorders, the best way to restore their health was to absorb fresh blood from an external source. Now, in modern times, we understand that soaking in animal blood has absolutely no health benefits, but medieval physicians had zero understanding of sanitation, meaning that they fully committed to the idea that swimming through fresh gore could somehow purify the body, which meant that if you walked into a medieval hospital suffering from anemia, unexplained weakness, or general fatigue, your doctor wouldn't prescribe rest, food, or structured recovery. No, they would grab the nearest cow, goat, or pig, collect an absolutely horrifying amount of warm blood, and immediately tell you to climb inside the tub. Absolutely unacceptable. The treatment process was just as horrifying as expected. Whenever a physician decided that a patient needed revitalization, they would prepare a large wooden tub, fill it with fresh blood, and instruct the sick person to sit inside and soak until their body supposedly absorbed life force energy. Which meant that if you were unlucky enough to receive bloodbath therapy, you could expect to endure immediate discomfort, because sitting inside a pool of warm, sticky blood is not enjoyable under any circumstances. Overwhelming stench, because animal blood begins decaying rapidly, meaning that after only a few minutes, the entire experience turns into an unbearable festival of rotting organic material. Guaranteed bacterial exposure, because medieval physicians never sterilized their supplies, meaning that blood baths were essentially just large pools of contaminated liquid designed to cause infections, rather than cure them. And if someone collapsed after spending too much time in the bath, doctors did not blame the deeply disgusting treatment method. They simply assumed the patient's humors were too corrupted to be saved, ignoring the fact that forcing people to soak in decomposing fluid was obviously a terrible idea. Unbelievable. The worst part. Not only did blood bath therapy fail completely, but it actively made patients sicker, because instead of curing disease, bathing in animal blood only guaranteed bacterial infections, fevers, and deeply unfortunate sepsis cases. Common consequences included rapid onset of illness, because submerging oneself in organic waste was just asking for microbial disasters. Skin infections, because exposure to contaminated fluid guaranteed irritation, inflammation, and deeply unpleasant results. Horrific long-term consequences, because repeated exposure often led to chronic illness rather than actual recovery. And when physicians saw patients deteriorating after blood baths, they did not blame their horrifying treatment methods. They simply claimed that the sickness was resisting purification and prescribed another round of blood bathing to increase absorption. Absolutely unacceptable. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone ever realize that sitting in animal blood was a terrible idea? Not for centuries. The practice remained wildly popular, with doctors confidently recommending extended blood soaks, despite the fact that 0 successful cases were ever recorded. It wasn't until medicine finally caught up with reality that blood bath therapy was abandoned, replaced by actual science. But by then, countless medieval patients had already suffered and died unnecessarily, all because their doctors insisted that swimming through gore was somehow beneficial. Alright, we have finally arrived at the last horrifying stop on this medieval medical nightmare. And trust me, it's just as disgusting and disastrous as everything else before it. At this point, you've endured leeches, bloodletting, boiling oil treatments, corpse-based medicine, blistering therapy, and even medieval kings aggressively spreading disease instead of curing it. But now, we're diving into honey and dung wound dressings. Because apparently, medieval doctors could not resist smearing filth on injuries and pretending it was helpful. Yes, that's right. If you walked into a medieval hospital with an open wound, infected cut, or deeply unfortunate medieval battle injury, your doctor would not prescribe clean bandages, herbal ointments, or any form of proper medical care. No. They would grab a handful of honey and mix it with animal dung, immediately slathering it onto your wound, confidently claiming that this was an excellent method of infection control. And this is how thousands of medieval people ended up covered in sticky bacteria-filled filth rather than receiving actual treatment. Absolutely unbelievable. Now, to be fair, honey actually has some medicinal properties, meaning that if medieval doctors had simply used pure honey, it might have actually helped in some cases. Honey contains natural antimicrobial properties, meaning that when applied correctly, it can help prevent infection and promote healing. So if medieval physicians had just used honey, and left out the deeply questionable additional ingredients. This treatment could have been slightly less terrible, but medieval doctors never stopped at good ideas. They always had to make things significantly worse, which meant that instead of using honey on its own, they confidently decided to mix it with literal farm waste. Because apparently, no medieval treatment was complete without adding something absolutely awful to the recipe. The treatment process was as horrifying as expected. Whenever a physician decided that a patient needed wound care, they would prepare their special medieval mixture using fresh honey, because at least this part made some amount of sense. Animal dung, because apparently medieval doctors thought germs were a myth. Random animal fat, because if farm waste wasn't enough, they needed something even worse. Once the deeply questionable mixture was prepared, doctors would press it directly onto the wound, smearing the infected area completely, ensuring that the patient was now covered in sticky, bacteria-filled filth instead of receiving proper care. And if the wound smelled worse over time, physicians did not take that as a sign of infection. Instead, they assumed that the treatment was working because strong odors meant disease was being pulled out of the body. Absolutely unacceptable. The worst part. Not only did this treatment fail completely, but it actively made infections worse, because instead of curing wounds, smearing literal waste into open injuries guaranteed sepsis, horrific fevers, and deeply painful deaths. Common consequences included immediate bacterial exposure, because the fastest way to ruin a wound is to rub dirty materials into it. Rapid infection, because medieval doctors never sterilized anything, meaning that this treatment was essentially just a speed run to fatal illness. Sepsis, because blood poisoning was basically inevitable at this point, and when patients collapsed from worsening infections. Medieval doctors did not blame their horrifying treatment method. They simply claimed that the disease had been too strong to overcome, and moved on to the next unfortunate medieval patient, preparing another batch of honey dung paste. Absolutely unbelievable. Eventually, as medicine advanced, this practice was finally abandoned, replaced by actual wound care techniques that did not involve rubbing filth into injuries. But by then, countless medieval patients had already suffered and died unnecessarily, all because their doctors insisted that farm waste was a reasonable cure for open wounds, because medieval medicine was never about saving lives. It was about ensuring maximum suffering before death. And now, finally, our long medieval medical nightmare comes to an end. We have explored every single horrifying treatment medieval doctors confidently believed in. We have seen absolute disasters unfold, and we have witnessed the worst healthcare decisions in history. And thankfully, you will never have to experience any of this yourself. So now, you may sleep peacefully, knowing that modern healthcare does not include bleeding, leeches, bird-based disease transfers, corpse medicine, blistering treatments, or farm waste wound care. But if you hear soft medieval whispers in the night, promising to cure you, well, that's probably nothing. Probably. Good night. May your humors forever remain balanced, and may no medieval barber, surgeon ever come near you.